Oh, hey. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Ethics Verse, the coolest place to be every Thursday at noon Eastern. If you're trying to make your workplaces better, we got a banger for you today, Defeating Analysis Paralysis, the Art and Science of Risk Assessments. We got a great group. We're going to have a great conversation. As always, couple of quick announcements. You can see, round of applause for Jack. We changed our interface. So this link tree, if you can't figure out how to do the QR code, you can just click that link tree link on the bottom of your screen, and you can see all the links to our YouTube page, which is blowing up. Pretty soon, we're gonna have one of those platinum plaques from YouTube. You can book a demo. You can download our world famous benchmark report. There's a lot going on there. Book of the day today is Reimagine Inclusion by Mita Malik. She was on the podcast that just dropped the other day. So definitely check that one out. Our podcast, of course, the world's greatest ethics and compliance podcast called The Ethics Experts, again, according to my mother. This is a great episode. We're talking about inclusion. So if you're somebody who is all for inclusion, all for diversity and equity, you're going to really like this, and you're going to really want to pick up this book. So as always, drop your link in the chat for your LinkedIn page. As we always say on the Ethics Verse, your net worth is your network, and neither are big enough. So connect with at least one person today. And as always, the people that are most active in the chat will get a book. So we're giving away 5 of these babies today. But the QR code there will take you directly to the Amazon page so you can pick up that book. I think it's going to launch like in a week or something. So definitely want to pick that up. Compliance Week is right around the corner. So we had another roundtable last week. Thanks for all those votes. Or I'm sorry, we had another roundtable yesterday. Thank you for all those votes. It was a smashing success. Compliance Week is a great opportunity for you to raise awareness in your organization. Our job is to crowdsource risk intelligence at scale. We can't do that unless we activate the human sensors in our company. Compliance Week is a great way to start humanizing your program, raising that awareness, driving some participation. And if you haven't planned for it yet, don't worry, we have you covered. We have a Compliance Week toolkit that's available. If somebody can drop that in the chat, that would be phenomenal. And it's got something for you to do every single day. We have a misconduct mystery game. You may have seen the video last week or at the roundtable. It's a lot of fun. It's a great way to illustrate some compliance concepts, some to reinforce some policies and get some fun participation among the team. So check that out. If you have questions, of course, let us know. We have a benchmark report, which you all should have seen by now. If you haven't, please let us know in the chat and we will have someone send it to you. This puts all the data together in the marketplace, the status quo, our data, a bunch of great tips on how you can improve your program. And for Ethics Verse members, because we love you, we're going to be giving away free custom benchmark reports. So go ahead and drop a 1 in the chat if you like a custom benchmark report. Somebody from our team will reach out to you, get some data, map it against the status quo, our benchmark, and give you some tips on how you can improve. So that's just more love from the Ethico team. The ecosystem, still going. You guys are never going to believe this. Last week, we had a demo with someone. And at the end of the demo, this person takes out their phone and starts doing a selfie. And we're like, what are you doing? What are you doing right now? And he said, I just want to capture this moment. This is the moment that I found the one. So if you have not checked out what's out there, we've totally rewritten our tool. It's been informed by people on the front lines, ethics and compliance professionals, to cut out a bunch of the busy work, to really streamline your process, bring to the top of your to-do list the most severe cases with a bunch of integrations to your HR system, to your other case management systems, whatever you might be doing, and a bunch of great analytics so you don't have to spend your time wringing your hands in Excel. So if you're interested in the ecosystem, click that link or drop a 2 in the chat and we'll go ahead and do that. A couple of other books we want to push because readers are leaders. That is so true. Mary Shirley's book is phenomenal. This is 65 hacks to level up your compliance program. Hit that QR code or come by, if you're going to be in Chicago, come by our booth. It's going to be more of a lounge this year, okay? So we have a no pitch zone booth at SCCE. We're going to be doing interviews. We're going to be showing some of the new software. And we got a nice place to kind of kick your feet up. And we brought literally like 400 books to give away. So we're going to be giving away Mary's book. So come by and grab one of those. Tom Fox's book, this is his all-time bestseller. This is a great, fun book to show your kids. It is Speaking Up is Awesome. And it's part of the Compliance Kids series. So go ahead and grab that. Also, we're going to be giving away Adam's book. So the books we're going to be giving away this year are Ron Carucci's book, To Be Honest, phenomenal. Adam Balfour's book, Compliance or Ethics and Compliance for Humans, Mary Shirley's book, Level Up, and the one and only Christian Hunt's book, Humanizing Rules. Okay, so four phenomenal books that all should be on your bookshelf. So definitely come by. We're gonna have some games at the booth. If you're coming to Chicago, drop a 5 in the chat, and someone will reach out to you to invite you to our party. We're doing a party on Tuesday night at the Rosebud. So I hope you can come, have some drinks, and we can meet in person. Next week, we're going to be talking about profit by prioritizing people. This is going to be the golden episode of the first week of October. So this is going to be all about how do we make a financial case for our program. So many of us struggle with trying to articulate our ROI. We're going to have a great, Tomel's going to be on, and we're going to have a great session about how can we articulate that ROI to get the budget we need. And then following up, the one and only Mary Shirley is joining us with Lisa Estrada for Hacking Ethical Innovation Cheat Codes to Level Up Your Program. So you do not want to miss that. So with that, let's get into our introductions. Look at if I looked like this, I would be ruling the world. Okay, so this is my aspirational self. This is what I look like in my dreams, I think. But I'm going to pass it. We have Michelle and Amber here. Michelle, why don't you do an introduction of Amber, and maybe Amber, you can introduce Michelle. These guys work together, put a great program together at Cox. But the floor is yours.
Absolutely. Thank you, Nick. This is awesome. I hope I can live up to my AI avatar here. I'm thrilled to introduce my friend, mentor, and my former leader at Cox Communications, Amber Hall. I'm so glad she was able to join us today. Amber is the Chief Compliance and Privacy Officer at Cox Communications, not just the third largest internet provider in the US, but also really an innovative technology company that is very highly regulated. Amber began her career as an analyst at Goldman Sachs and then went to law school. She started working in a large law firm, but I first met Amber when she had transitioned to her in-house role at Cox Enterprises, the parent company of Cox Communications. And there she was responsible for corporate governance and compliance. She left Cox to pursue an opportunity at Wells Fargo, small bank, not sure if you ever heard of it, where she led their ethics program during a very crazy, trying time at that organization. And I was so thrilled when she was asked to come back to CCI and join as the leader of the Privacy and Compliance Office. And I was on her team. And I believe that Amber is one of the most thoughtful and ethical leaders in this space. She leads with the perfect balance, in my mind, of the discipline of the financial service industry with also the empathy and self-awareness that I think is truly needed to build a culture of compliance and to lead that at a large organization. So I'm so grateful that she could join us here today, and I can't wait to share some of the lessons we learned as we rolled out a robust regulatory risk assessment program together.
Well, round of applause for that introduction. That was amazing. Maybe sometime you can give me an introduction like that. Amber,
sure.
Try to top that one. That was pretty good.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. Thank you, Michelle. That was just amazing. I am so excited to be here. Michelle is absolutely fantastic. She is struck out on her own with Artemis, with her Artemis consulting team. And like Michelle said, we first worked together many, many years ago when I was a client of hers when she was with PwC. And then I was thrilled when I joined Cox Communications as the Chief Compliance and Privacy Officer that Michelle was on the team. And her role really was to take our longstanding risk assessment program and turn it into one that was more objective and allowed compliance to more easily partner with the business to help mitigate risk. And she was the perfect person to do that. She also worked on my team, focused on financial fraud and conducting investigations as well. Michelle has this unique ability to dissect complicated problems and to speak not only in the language of business, but in the language of lawyers as well, which as a lawyer, and for those of you that are lawyers or have the, I'm going to say, pleasure of working with lawyers, you know that sometimes it's important to have a translator, and that's definitely Michelle. Her diverse experience as an outside consultant and an in-house advisor makes her, and working with lots of legal teams, really is the foundation of her action-oriented approach. I consider Michelle to be an advisor and a friend, and I'm thrilled to be here with her today and with all of you. Wow. Thanks.
Wow. So that was pretty good. I mean, those are two of the best introductions I've ever heard in my life. Those are phenomenal. All right. So we're going to be talking about defeating analysis paralysis. Amber mentioned that Michelle started Artemis Advisory. So I met Michelle at the Women's Conference because I'm one of the world's great male allies. And I met her at this conference, and she gave a couple of talks that really resonated deeply with me. I learned a little bit about Artemis. And let me just tell you a little bit about Artemis before we get started. So Artemis Advisory, Artemis is the goddess of the hunt, I believe. Artemis Advisory is a boutique consulting firm focused on helping business leaders accomplish their strategic compliance and risk management goals. So you can hit these QR codes to see the website and connect with them on LinkedIn. Michelle, as you heard, is the founder of Artemis Advisory, and she specializes in providing nimble, cost-effective solutions to address the growing pressure on legal, compliance, and risk management leaders to accomplish more. She's got a lot of great diverse experience as a outside consultant and in-house advisor to business and legal teams, and that's the foundation for her action-oriented approach, which you're going to get to see in action today. So if you're not following Michelle or Amber on LinkedIn, go ahead and do that. Again, hit these QR codes. If you don't know how to do a QR code at this point, you should probably, let's just YouTube that. Okay, it's very easy. You just take a quick picture and that'll get you right to the to those links. Okay, let's dive in to the presentation.
Awesome. Thank you, Nick. Hello, everybody. We are going to kick off with a couple very dry topics, and then we'll make a lot of sense later, because part of Amber and my philosophy really goes into the basics of internal audit, 3-line model, and the DOJ guidance. So any ethics and compliance professional probably knows what those things are, but we're going to force you to sit through this part a little bit, because then so much more of the rest of our presentation will make sense. So we want to start with the 3 lines model. For those of you who aren't familiar with this, this is developed and put out by the Institute of Internal Auditors, and it was previously called the 3 lines of defense model. And anyone in the financial services industry would be very familiar with this, and hopefully many of you are. And the purpose of the 3 lines model is really to help organizations identify the structures and processes that help them best achieve their business goals through governance, through risk management. And the reason why this is so important to us is because we really used this philosophy to drive accountability and find the right folks in our organization that needed to engage with us in our risk assessment program. So Amber, I would love for you to chime in with where you believe the business and the ethics and compliance team sits within the 3-line model.
Okay, absolutely. So the business sits within the 1st line and compliance sits within the 2nd line. And it's so important to, I guess, think of this as a foundation, because, I know from experience, and I bet for those ethics and compliance professionals out there, you hear the same thing when you go to the business. They're like, oh, compliance? Well, you own that, don't you? You're compliance. And it's like, no. You create the risk by the business function that you do. So our role in the 2nd line is really to provide support and advice and guidance to the 1st line, right? And to assess and provide opportunities for the 1st line to enhance their controls to mitigate risk. So 2nd line, ethics and compliance. 1st line is the business.
And then it wouldn't be a 3-line model without that 3rd line, of course. And so we felt very strongly that we wanted to really engage and empower the business, make sure they knew they were the 1st line of defense. But we also want to point out that many organizations, hopefully yours, has a really valuable asset in your internal audit team. And we were very fortunate to have a very strong partnership with our internal audit team at Cox Enterprises, the parent company, but not so strong of a partnership that we weren't able to maintain that independence and achieve that objective opinion. And so we leveraged that internal audit resource frequently when we were hoping to really get that objective independent analysis of different areas of regulatory risk and controls. You may or may not have that in your organization. But I will tell you that there will be some group or service or team out there that you could hire externally should you ever need to evaluate your compliance program and objectives. And so don't forget the third line. That can be a really valuable resource in your risk assessment.
So how have you seen folks utilize that third line to get some insights, maybe not in just sort of a regular audit capacity, but maybe they have an accountant who has an audit background, or they actually have an audit team, but they don't have the budget perhaps to engage somebody on that kind of program assessment. What tips would you give to utilize this phenomenal resource who has that sort of audit mind to get some insights that we might be able to take action on sooner?
Yeah, well, I would chime in and say, I am a CPA. I came up through the audit world, and so this is inherent to how I came up. But it comes down to me to your basic audit procedures, right? So come in, understand the scope of what you're trying to evaluate, create a reasonable sample and a logical sample size, and then test whether that activity is meeting the expectations that are provided by the regulatory requirement, or B, your own company's policies and procedures. So really just engaging that resource to say, hey, we need you to come look at this objectively, tell us, is this working, and where are the gaps? And report that to us. And you want to be able to give them just enough information to know what is needed to be done and to know what the requirements are, but not so much information that they're not going to independently identify it themselves.
That's great. Thank you.
And if I could jump in and say one other thing from a corporate perspective, I think leveraging your internal audit team is really important as well. If there are items that you need to highlight for your executive team or for the board, this is a great way to have this independent group come in and determine, are there areas of opportunity? And the business can then go to the executive team or go to the board and ask for the resources necessary to address that. But be able to do it without having to spend the additional funds to go to an outside auditor and address it that way.
Perfect. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to be throwing these kind of wrenches into this presentation throughout. So.
I love it. Keep us on our toes, Nick. Let's make it fun. Okay, so let's move on. And so again, one more dry topic, and then I promise we'll really get into the fun stuff. If anyone on here who's a compliance professional is familiar with the latest guidance from the Department of Justice, it first came out in June of 2020, and it was most recently updated in March of this year. We're not going to go into all the details of that guidance because we know you could have an entire webinar series on that, but we want to bring it up because we always found this to be a really impactful message to the business, and that was to show how prominent risk assessment is in this guidance if your compliance program were to be evaluated. And so for those of you familiar with the guidance, you'll know that it asks 3 key questions. Is your corporation's program well designed? Is it adequately resourced and empowered to function? And does it work in practice? And the reason why we highlighted that first question is because within the additional explanation of that first question, the guidance offers 6 categories. And the very first one is risk assessment. So it goes into some of those additional effective elements like policies and procedures, training, communications, third-party risk, but front and center is risk management. And then if you dig down a little further into the risk management section, it really breaks it out into 4 key categories. And once you can hone in on those few paragraphs, it becomes very clear what the expectations are, at least from the perspective of the Department of Justice. And those are, what is your methodology? What is your approach? How are you conducting your risk assessment? And the part I love as a kind of former auditor data nerd is the metric side. It's not just about, hey, how many people did you get to sit in a room and talk about the risk? It's about how are you actually evaluating it? What are those numbers? What are those KPIs? What is the data that you are using to assess your risk? The second, of course, is resource allocation. And so that kind of goes back a little bit to the second question. But with the Department of Justice, my interpretation of what they're trying to get at here is, are you throwing a bunch of resources at an area of low risk and low impact to your organization and leaving your company exposed somewhere else? Or are you evaluating your risk and allocating those resources accordingly? Amber, just so I'm not the only one talking about this, I clearly get excited when it comes to this guidance. What are your thoughts on on the other two categories here?
Yeah, so I would say definitely just to hone in again on resource allocation, sitting in an ethics and compliance organization, I feel like we are always looking, trying to get those resources. The risk assessment is a great way to have data and insights to get to those executive team leaders to get those resources. But we also have to remember that gone are the days where you could have an assessment and stick it in a drawer and go back and kind of look at it next year and say, oh, how did we do? How are things going? No, you've got to keep it updated. You've got to revise it because the business keeps moving, right? If we, in our space, if we're stagnant, we're out of here, right? So as the business moves, your assessment's going to have to evolve and change as well. And then always take time to have a postmortem. What are the lessons that you learned? And then how are you incorporating those lessons to the next assessment, or working with the business to incorporate those lessons into the compliance programs they're building?
I mean, if you're running your business from through a risk lens or from an integrated risk approach, it's an ongoing process, to Amber's point, right? This is a journey that we're on. This is not a kind of, I'm going to work out once and think that I'm in shape. We have to change our lifestyle, so to speak, if we want to see those real gains. And just to kind of reiterate that, we can't leave that thing in the drawer. There's kind of one other thing I want to touch on this. I think, this is called the art and science of risk assessments. There's a lot of persuasive power in this slide. There's a lot of things you can pull from this DOJ guidance in your talk tracks to leadership to get those resources. The big three on the left here: is it designed right? Is it empowered? And do we have, are we, does it work, right? Like, those are the things that we're sort of solving for. And if we're put in place within our organizations to help our organizations navigate through the kind of, this kind of stuff, right? So utilizing this as a leverage point for those conversations can be extremely impactful, because you're not just coming up with this stuff on your own. This is backed up by the DOJ, and the more stuff that we can utilize to build a more compelling case and be more persuasive, the better off we're going to be, and the more resources we're ultimately going to be able to obtain.
Mm-hmm. That's great.
Thank you. Okay, so we will move on from the DOJ, everybody, because I think this was really important to Amber and me, and that is, beyond the guidance, beyond the internal auditors' models, the dry, boring stuff, why does a risk assessment, why does the process and the program matter to your business? And I came up with these 3 A's: the awareness, accountability, and action, and wanted to walk through each one of those and share with you how we were able to use the program to really build on those 3 things. So Amber, do you want to kick off with awareness and accountability?
Yeah, sure. So with awareness, again, this goes back to the thought, and accountability for that matter. My favorite phrase, oh, well, compliance owns this. And saying, no, it doesn't, and leveraging the 3 lines of defense. We also found out when Michelle came in to enhance our risk assessment program, we found out that the middle layer of the organization, or of a function area, very well aware of the risk or the reg that we are coming in to assess. But once you got above that layer, the senior leader or the executive over that function had no idea that they were accountable for the risk. And so building that awareness is key, because again, that senior executive is the person that's going to provide resources. If something goes wrong, that senior executive is the person that's going to be brought in for questions by the DOJ or by others. So building that awareness up the chain is as important as building awareness within the organization. And then with accountability, again, I think it's the pushback is real. I think we've all experienced that when they say that compliance owns it, compliance owns the risk. But I have found that the 3 lines model has been magnificent in illustrating who owns the risk. And I would also say the best part of accountability from my perspective is that sharing with them and with leaders, you are accountable for the risk, but you're not alone. Compliance is here to help you. We're here to support the business in assessing and developing controls. We're going to work with audit to test these controls. We're going to provide an objective assessment that can be used to help provide resources, as we've talked about. So accountability and awareness are important, but it's also a great opportunity to share. Kind of compliance is not here as the cop to tell you you're doing things wrong. We're really here as a partner to get our hands dirty and really help and work together to mitigate risk for the company.
Coaches, not cops. That's going to be my new shirt that we're going to make.
Yep. Yes.
I got a question from Tiffany. Hey, Tiffany, how do we get the board of directors to understand a high risk after an audit, even if they don't see it as a high risk? How do you navigate that kind of a discussion?
I would jump in and say, I would love to chime in on this. And I wonder, Tiffany, if we could bookmark that, because when we get towards the end of our discussion today, we want to share some of the ways that we presented this information and talk about the importance of understanding who your audience is and how to best communicate with them. And I think that will be a really great way to bring this up.
All right,
I want to make sure we
hold us accountable to that.
I will hold you accountable. I also want, before we move on, I want to talk about action, because this is the thing that I found to be the most impactful when you lead a risk assessment program correctly. I've always said to the business, the worst thing you can do is to conduct a risk assessment, document a bunch of risk, and then do nothing about it and have a trend year over year of risk that doesn't move, that doesn't change whatsoever, because nothing's been done. So the process that we put into place, I think, really forced action, because people knew that we're going to come back and they're going to evaluate us again the same time next year. And if we don't see any movement, how do we account for that? Or at least they would be prepared to explain why there wasn't any movement and what their plan was to get there. And so empowering those resources and that business to know that this is their responsibility, and then not doing it for them, because most of the time the compliance department is much smaller than the business team that you're working with, but helping advise them to get them the resources they need, whether that's people, process, or technology. Okay, so let's move on to this slide, and bear with me because I put a lot of animations in my slide, and the slides I sent over are a little bit layered, and that's why it's accountability and then why. But I think this slide still really explains what Amber and I wanted to share with you today. Because again, I think what we really want to do is make sure you're understanding who your stakeholders are and how to communicate with them. We're going to go back and forth between the art and the science of risk assessment. This slide is a little bit art and a little bit science, and we'll explain why. This pie chart here represents broad enterprise risk categories. Your business may have others, but supply chain, financial risk, your safety and facilities, cybersecurity, regulatory risk, those things can be part of a broader enterprise risk program and risk model. In the case of our program, we carved out this little blue section. You can see that was an image of a piece of a pie where regulatory risk was carved out. That made sense for us because we are, Cox is a highly regulated business in an ever-evolving, innovative technology industry. So we built the business case around that specific regulatory risk, and we built our program in a way that we could share that piece of the pie and evaluate it the same way that we evaluated broader enterprise risk. This green section here, you might be conducting just an ethics and compliance risk assessment program. This is assessing the risk of the gaps in your ethics and compliance program. This is something I'm doing now at Artemis Advisory for clients, and that is looking at those effective elements of a compliance program and saying, what is the risk here? What is the roadmap to get your compliance department to where it needs to be to best fit your organization? So you could very easily, your risk assessment could be pieces of this pie, or honestly, depending on how your organization is structured, you could be evaluating all these risks. And one of the beauties of an objective, consistent, repeatable risk assessment process with a defined methodology, and we're going to share ours in a moment, is that you could evaluate every single one of these risks using the exact same methods, and you could create a true apples to apples comparison of and a relative risk ranking of these different risk categories. And that can really help you, I think, to Tiffany's question, start to tell the story to your board and your business about why this risk matters and where it sits in your organization.
And if I could just add one other thing, I think it's important that, and it may seem elementary, but it's important that we define what your risk assessment program is actually assessing. At a roundtable with other chief compliance officers, we had a discussion about risk assessments, but kind of halfway through the process and having great dialogue, we realized that how we define risk assessments and the universe that we considered were all different, right? So some compliance officers were tasked with assessing risk of all of these categories and more. Some were tasked with conducting a risk assessment with just the ethics and compliance program assessment. Some were just regulatory. So clearly define, and particularly when going to the executive level and going to the board, make sure that they understand the universe of the risk that you're assessing, because it's not as vanilla as you may think.
Yeah, and I think if you can apply or if you can bring to those kinds of conversations a framework and a structure, it helps this person on the other side of the table who's not living in the weeds of this all the time understand kind of the lay of the land a little bit better and what they're talking about. Sometimes things are very clear to us. This is kind of like the expert's curse. It's very clear to us because we're living in it so deeply, and we just live and breathe this kind of stuff. We forget that somebody on the other side of the table, doesn't understand sort of the nuance in it. And so again, our job is to be persuasive. Our job is to help our organization navigate, traverse across the risk landscape. And the more we can provide value in terms of describing that landscape, the more we start to elevate ourselves as trusted advisors in the organization.
Yeah, that's great.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's get into the science. Remember, we go back and forth. This will likely look very familiar, the methodology we're going to speak of here with compliance and ethics professionals in the audience. But here's how we broke out our risk assessment. It was a multi-dimensional risk assessment where we were working our way towards what we called the residual risk. And the first way we began to calculate that risk is we calculated what we call the inherent risk. So this is the inherent risk of an issue occurring with the specific regulatory requirement that we were evaluating. And in order to get there, we looked at three categories: likelihood, impact, and velocity. And so likelihood is how likely is it that we're going to have an issue with this in the next 1 year, 3 year, 5 years? Like, have we had an issue in the past or not? What is the impact if something does go wrong here? What's the financial impact? Not only financial impact, what would we take a hit to our reputation? What really matters to us? I'll give an example. The owners and the family that owns Cox Enterprises, they are advocates for the environment and sustainability. And of course, the business is going to do everything they can to make sure that there was no negative environmental impact. But in the case of if there was an issue that would really put us in a position where Cox, this business whose values are based around environmental health and sustainability, that would be a big deal. And so in addition to, again, that financial impact, the reputational harm, we really thought about what are our core values as a business and how do we make sure that we're living those values and that we're not going counter to them. And so that was built into our impact analysis as well. And then the third category is velocity, and that's relatively new in the risk management space in that this is where I would go to the experts on our regulatory team, the professors that I call them, and say, like, what is happening in enforcement in this area? What is happening in the legislature? Like, what are we looking at? What's changing and growing, and how will that impact our inherent risk? And Amber, before we move into the next section, would love for you to share how we determine who should fill this section of the questionnaire out.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's really the subject matter experts. Those, I mean, very fortunate in our legal department that we have SMEs that really own a multitude of regulations. So working with them to, like Michelle said, get an understanding of what's happening in that space, what's the penalties that we've seen, and is this an area of focus for the particular regulator? We also work with outside counsel on certain risks where we may not have that internal SME in-house. What's interesting is now we're going through the second year of our assessment, and whereas the first year, working with the SMEs, it was, with any professor, it's like, well, there's this arcane situation that happened here. It's like, okay, no, the likelihood of that happening ever again that's not what I want to know about. Now, the second time around, they understand what we're looking for, and it's been very much a seamless, it's been a very easy process working with our various subject matter experts.
Yeah. Moral of the story there is the first year is always the hardest. It gets a little bit easier each time that you're coming back with the same information.
We got a great question. We got a bunch of great questions, which maybe we'll bring at the end, but a quick question from Faisal. Hey, Faisal, can you give us an example of velocity? And he echoed that was my question. So talk to us a little bit about velocity, because this is kind of a new concept that I think a lot of us haven't really been incorporating in our risk assessment approach.
Yeah, so I'll tell you how the best example I can provide from the perspective was, I think just for a little context, I want to say we had 15 questions in our questionnaire for inherent risk, and 2 of them were velocity. So they were mostly likelihood and impact. And the 2 questions were, has there been any recent enforcement actions in this area? And have there been any changes in the law or legislation in this area? And the one that jumps out to me was the specific regulations we were evaluating related to privacy laws. Those always scored higher in the velocity category, because there was, especially at the time I was there, so much movement, so much happening with the California privacy laws changing, new states adopting privacy laws. So hopefully that's a good example, but that was a very obvious one that jumped out to me. There were some other nuanced ones, but that was an area that really elevated the inherent risk score for the specific regulatory requirements for privacy.
And
that's a great example.
Another example.
Go ahead. Yeah, please go. Yeah.
I'll give another example that I think most of us on the call can relate to. Generative AI, right? So there is, it's last year that was probably something that most of us weren't thinking about. This year, not only are we thinking about how is the business using it, but we know if you follow Washington and you follow the state legislatures, that they are considering how do we regulate AI. Right. So there's a lot of turbulence when it comes to a generative AI. So that's another.
That's a great example. I think George added a great comment here. Hey, George, risk velocity measures how fast an exposure can impact the organization. It's the time that passes between the occurrence of an event and the point at which the organization first feels its effects. So it's a great kind of way to add some dimensionality to this sort of, 2-dimension thing that we've traditionally thought of. Okay, thank you.
Great.
Okay, and so just to keep moving forward, the second layer of our analysis was control risk, and here's where we were really pulling from the DOJ guidance, the U.S. federal sentencing guidelines. We were taking those core compliance program elements and applying that to the business. And at the end of the day, it's your basic. Are you training your people? Like, do they know that you're responsible for this risk and that they need to make sure that they're following these requirements? I say governance, but it was really more that accountability. Is there someone on your team that owns this and understands this and is working with us to complete this assessment every year? do you have a mechanism to report if there's an issue? Or is your team trained to know that they can use the ethics hotline? And have you audited it recently? Are you monitoring it? We were asking those questions. Included in this circle is policies, but it may not be a specific policy. It might more likely be a standard operating procedure or even some sort of relatively informal document, but something that lives within that team that is maintained and kept up to date and is provided to anyone new joining the team so they understand what their responsibilities are. So we looked at both of those things.
Yeah. Can I just add something really quickly? And then what's interesting in my world, at Cox, we have people that stay at the organization for a long time. So when we get to these questions, it's like, well, no, we haven't written anything down because Jack, he owns it, he does it. Well, Jack is probably going to retire soon. Like, don't we need to have something documented that outlines of the control that we have in place? Don't we need to have some sort of training in place? And I don't know if it's the next slide or if it's this slide. What's also important in this, again, is making sure that there's awareness up the chain. So we can, when we meet with the executives, we can say, okay, you're all over it, Jack's doing it, but let's think about how we educate those, make sure that other folks on the team, or we're cross-training, or we need some documentation.
Great point.
Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you, Amber. Okay, so science, art. I want to move to art again because I think, again,
I love, sorry to interrupt. I love when there's a really great introduction and then you guys live up to it and you blow past it. So this is phenomenal, phenomenal. So I hope people are taking notes and dialing into the replay because there's a lot here. So keep going though, please.
Yeah. We hope this helps. I mean it that Nick and I have talked about this before. One of my favorite things about being part of the compliance community is we're so open and we share. And
right,
Amber and I are going to share things today that you're going to go, that will not work in my organization at all. But to me, that's still information. That's still data point because it might help make you go, okay, well, that wouldn't work, but this would. And I think this slide is a really great segue to introduce this slide, which is what's going to resonate with your audience. I'll tell you a little bit about my story here. So it was right before Amber joined, and this was a metaphor that I had used with so many clients up to the point when I had moved over to Cox. And that was you're digging a hole and your controls are going to help you climb out of it. And so the idea was that as you increased your inherent risk, as an area became more risky, you were digging into a hole, but you're going to have policies and you're going to have training and you're going to have governance and you're going to have monitoring and you're going to climb your way out of the hole. And I thought I was so brilliant, and it worked for a lot of organizations. And our former CCO before Amber was like, sure, Michelle, but no, that's not going to work. And the reason why is the way that came out in our actual score. And you may never, by the way, in your organization, you may never share your actual number or score, but our former CCO wanted to be prepared to be able to share that number. And what that meant was the inherent risk was digging a hole, like a negative score, and the controls were climbing out. But you might have a team that's doing everything right and they still ended up with a negative score. And my metaphor, it kind of all fell apart when she was like, we absolutely cannot go to the business and give them a negative score, even if you tell this story really well. And so I had to pivot and I had to quickly flip that script. And around the time Amber came on was when we shifted to what I call the thermometer approach. And in here, what we shared and the way we described it to the business, because let's be honest, you cannot go to your business team and use words like velocity, U.S. federal sentencing guidelines, Department of Justice, effective elements of, you can't do that. Don't do that. Promise me you won't do that. Come to them with a metaphor and a story that works. And for us, it was the thermometer. So the idea here is, as an area of your business is inherently risky, it's going to be hotter, it's going to be raising the temperature, and the controls, all the things that the first line of defense is doing, is going to be lowering that temperature. So that worked for us. And hopefully one of those two will work for you, or you can come up with your own. But going with the thermometer approach, we wanted to show you a little bit about how we just dive a little deeper in how we analyze inherent risk. And so bear with me with this animation. But again, here you have the temperature is increasing. That's your inherent risk score. As you evaluate controls and identify more controls, that's your control score is going to be lowering that temperature. And what you were left with was residual risk. So again, that's the thermometer approach and how that worked for us. And I know we have about 15 minutes left, but I want to say the rest of the presentation is going to share with you how Amber and I then took that number, that single number, and put it into a presentation that we felt really resonated with the business audience. Amber, Nick, is there anything else you want to add here before we move on?
No, you're doing great. You're doing great.
Okay, I know. I just want to make sure we get through this because I have just so much I want to share on this topic. So, okay, back to the art and the science again. What problem are you trying to solve? So you've done the risk assessment program, you've assigned accountability, you've analyzed inherent risk and control risk and residual risk, and you got all this information. What are you trying to solve, and how do you share that with your business? And so there could be many problems you're trying to solve. We just mapped out 2 here for you to consider. The first is, where are you in your program? Do you just need some quick wins to build momentum, right? You just got to get some wins under your belt so you can be training your team, empowering your team, and getting them moving and thinking about compliance the right way? Maybe yes. Or are you at the stage of maturity where you're like, nope, we are here to build a consistent, repeatable risk evaluation where we're going to have objective results year over year, and I'm going to be able to present this in a really compelling way. Maybe it's both. This was something Amber and I talked about beforehand. Maybe you need both of those things right now. And so it's just 2 different ways of thinking about it and approaches to presenting your results, because they're your results. There is no standard template that every business has to use when it comes to compliance. I mean, I come from the auditor background. I know that there's all sorts of rules for other areas, but you want to make this program work for you and your business, in my opinion. So let's look at an idea that we have if you wanted to think about that effort and impact approach, that quick win. And so this is an example of a formula I used recently with a client, because they had a compliance program. They were doing compliance program things, but they just didn't know that they were doing those things. And they wanted to really centralize and be able to say, this is the compliance program we have. And so I worked with them to evaluate the existing elements that they had in place and created a list of, I think, 14 or 15 recommendations. And instead of charting those out based on risk, I knew that they were in the stage of maturity where they really just needed a roadmap where they could start to build some momentum and identify some quick wins. And so that's where we came up with the effort and impact chart. So as you can see here, what we did, or what I did in this particular situation, was on the y-axis, the vertical axis, evaluated relatively whether it was high or low impact, effort. And then on the x-axis, that horizontal axis, evaluated the impact. And as we plotted those recommendations, any recommendation that plotted in that awesome green zone, that was on my list for that program, to that department, to say, start here. These are relatively high impact, relatively low effort, quick wins that you can get under your belt and move this program forward. I am not saying that you should never do the red zone. There was one particular recommendation that was absolutely needed to be done. And not saying this was the recommendation, but one thing that comes to mind is most organizations need to build a robust third-party risk management program. There's a lot to that, right? There's a lot of different business teams that need to be involved. There's technology that you need. That's sometimes, in my experience, an area that lands in the red, but it doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. It just means perhaps there's some other things you can do to start to build that momentum to then come to the table to your business and say, okay, now we're ready to go all in on, for example, third-party risk management.
It shows a methodology. It shows some method to the madness, and it shows that you're really thinking through, where you're going to be able to have the most meaningful impact, given the resource set that you have and given the sort of inherent risks that are in place. Again, elevating, not that we're just like wandering through this desert, but we have a targeted approach. We have we've kind of mapped our journey for where we need to take our program and the impact we need to make on the business.
That's exactly right. And I was just going to chime in here and say, bring your senior team, bring your board along on that journey. Right?
100%.
So if you are looking and analyzing this from an effort versus impact sort of framework, then bring them along and tell them why you're focusing on the green first, right? And the timeline for focusing on the red.
Well, and just like if we can go beyond there's multiple layers to all of our communication. We're talking about our risk assessment in our approach. There's sort of an inherent, or there's like another layer. It's more ethereal. It's more in that, system one type of thinking. But, a board has a fiduciary duty to oversee an organization, and they want to kind of know the why behind the what. They many times don't want to get it into the weeds, but they'd like to at least feel, I hope there's no board members on here, they'd like to at least feel like they're playing some kind of a role in it. And to Amber's point, when you can show them like what's kind of going into the recipe, and they can, at least kind of speak to that or ask a couple of extra questions, well, when it comes time to do it, they're going to feel like they're part of that process, not, as opposed to that process being sort of thrust upon them and them not having any say in it. So it's a very strategic way to get the buy-in you need and play a little bit more of a chess match instead of a game of Chinese checkers or something,
Yes, exactly.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, so then let's look at the way that Amber and I, this is what worked for us and for our organization at the time. So again, this is maybe a little bit more of the scientific risk assessment approach. And so if you think about, I'm trying to follow the comments, by the way, but I'm just getting so excited and looking at the slides. And I did see someone mention, oh, did you use the thermometer instead of the heat map? No. We the thermometer for us was more of like educating, training, change management, coaching. The heat map was concept. Mm-hmm. Yes. This, we were absolutely, I'm still an auditor at heart, guys. Like I needed my heat map. But here was the approach that we used, and it worked really well with the broader business leaders because it was modeled after the way that our finance department had evaluated broader enterprise risk. So different inputs, Smart. Much more scientific approach, but the ultimate end result was the same. So it was very familiar with our audience. So think about what your executives are seeing from other teams, because you might not need to reinvent the wheel and come up with something on your own. You could leverage that. And maybe it's not your favorite, but it's going to work a lot better, potentially, because they've already seen it before. They've already been through the pitch. And so this worked really well for us. And what we did was again, that vertical y-axis, that's the inherent risk. So as the score was higher, as the temperature was higher, that moved you up into this red and orange zone, the top two quadrants. And then as we evaluated the controls, that moved you from left to right. So more controls in place to the right, that would move you more from that yellow to green. And in the end result, what we came up with was we had a list of like over 100 different risk areas. And we were able to say, remember those initial questions at the beginning from the DOJ guidance? Are your resources, are you allocating your resources appropriately? We felt very strongly like we had a very compelling story that we did this objective organization-wide risk assessment, and we plotted these areas landed in the red, and on a relative basis, those were highest risk areas with the relatively least amount of controls. We're not saying no controls. We're just saying like relative to other areas of the business, we need to invest more here. We need some monitoring technology. We need maybe it's more people. That's sometimes, as we know, a harder sell, but maybe, or we need to bring in an outside party to help us get up to speed here. We had a story, and we were able to go to the business and say, we're not saying the whole organization's on fire. We're saying these areas we really need to focus on. And then I think it's important to note we had what I think was a really good story, and because the orange box I think is a tricky one because you cannot ignore the risks that are in the orange box, because relatively speaking, those are the highest risks of your organization. But we had, for example, a very robust and still do privacy compliance program. Amber's the leader of that. The organization also had a really strong privacy operations team. We had very recently updated policies and procedures, robust training, a very significant monitoring effort. So even though that plotted as one of the higher risk areas of the organization, it landed very strongly in the orange. And so it kind of lived in this sort of maintenance mode, like, hey, we're good here because we're managing a really high risk area. But we don't need to freak out because it's in the top quadrant. That's why it landed in orange. Amber, is there anything else you want to share on this? Because I know this was a big part of how you communicate to your board and executive team.
Yeah. So I'd be remiss as a lawyer if I didn't say, if you go with the prior version and it's more around quick wins, if you have a risk that ends up in this red quadrant with high risk, less controls, you are now on notice that you have it. So even if the journey to moving it or to putting more controls in place takes some time, you've got to begin documenting how you are moving that risk and putting those controls in place.
Yes. And I think what I should mention too is, as part of my calculus for effort and impact, if it was a really high risk area, that meant, in my opinion, that moving forward would create a high impact to your organization. And so that would help move it over to that side. So I think it's, again, art and a science. You got to make this work for you, and you got to make sure, to Amber's point, that you're considering all different factors in play and looking at them both.
But, Amber's point ties back to that slide with the DOJ guidance, in the top right, because again, this is a journey. You're never going to sort of kick off this process. You're not going to leave this webinar and just have a brand new, risk assessment that you're going to wave this magic wand and all these risks are going to be taken care of and all these controls are going to be in place. To Amber's point from the beginning, we have to have that postmortem. A postmortem is worthless unless you're documenting what's going on and you're, starting to build this story of this journey that you're on. And if you can be documenting, this is great from that book Principles, but if you can be documenting along the way your rationale for the decisions that you're making, not only are you going to be not only is that kind of a CYA move in the context of whatever you've been put on notice for, but it also allows you to go back and say, okay, you can do another postmortem and say, okay, well, was my rationale correct? Were the decisions we made to attack this risk or attack this risk in this way correct? And you can begin to have just keep making notes. That documentation process is super critical to not only build that story, but to promote that sort of continuous improvement of this risk, assessment process that's going to be a living thing throughout your organization.
Absolutely.
That's great.
And the last slide was, again, it's a little bit off here, but the quadrants might not work for you. That doesn't mean you have to use them. You can use more of a gradient and you can plot your risks that way. And we happen to just put them as dots on the heat map. This might look a little bit more familiar to those in the audience because it's more of a gradient. And you could tell the story a little differently, where you can not eliminate and forget about, but move past the green and focus on a broader area of red for risk. And that's it. I know we're 1 minute away, but that's it from a slide content. Yeah.
Round of applause for Michelle and Amber. If you guys are down to stick around for a couple of minutes, there were some really great questions in the chat, and I'm sure you guys will have something to say about them. So the first one is from Jim at 12:30. Check my notes here. He said, how do you ensure, maybe this gets tabled for later in a similar, that you audit against the best use of resources? I've seen a lot of audit focus on what an org views as the lower risk levels. So how do we do that? How do we ensure about resources? And maybe you can answer this in conjunction with this other question. Bear with me here as you're thinking of your answer there. How do we best determine resource allocation? Is there a smart way to do it? Can we leverage on subject matter experts in other parts of the organization? Should we get external folks? How do we navigate this sort of resource question, both from an audit and an allocation perspective?
I'd say yes. 5 yeses.
I mean, you have to know, Amber and I are not shy about going to people in our organization and outside and saying, we are not the experts on this. Teach us, train us, tell us, help us. As a compliance professional, it is not humanly possible, or at least I have not yet met someone who can know all the nuances of all the risk. I always say, I try to pride myself in if I don't know the answer, I do not pretend to know the answer, but I know how to find that answer. And anyone who came up in a consulting firm or a law firm, I think that becomes inherent in your training, that you go to find that expert in your firm or in your group. So I think you have to go. And by the way, and I'll add one more thing. There was a point where I came up with a metric where my team and we had so many meetings and so many hours of meetings, and I had come from this billable hours world. I wanted to know how much time I had spent at these meetings. So the senior manager on our team went back through our calendar and actually calculated it, and it was a lot. And I will tell you, at a lot of those meetings, I wanted to just I wanted to just cry because there was so much deep technical information. It was information overload. I just wanted to put my head down. And I will say that even if I only retained 5 or 10% of that, two things happened. One, I retained 5 to 10% of that. And the next time I had the conversation, I knew a little bit more. The next time I spoke to someone, there was something about the vernacular that I was able to pick up on. So don't discount that. And the second thing is, that person may have never been asked what they do and how they do that. Just think about that for a moment, because there are people deep within large organizations that are experts at what they do, but they never really get the opportunity to share. I had product engineers pull up flowcharts, and I am a flowchart gal, and they made my brain hurt because they were so detailed and technical, and they were so proud to share that. And that is a relationship that you have just built, and that is trust building, and that is respect. And don't discount that exercise by just going out to that team and getting their perspective. That's what I'll say on the topic. Amber?
Yeah, I think that's super spot on, but you said something else that I think is really important. Our value is not in our plan, it's in our ability to plan. It's not in having the answers, it's in finding the answers. And if we can shift our focus to that, it opens up a whole new sort of world, not to be too dramatic, but it opens up a whole new world of resources that we can employ to get the answers we need. We don't have to have all those answers, but our job should be to find it. It's not to be right, but our job is to get it right. And you can't get it right on your own. And again, take advantage of things like the Ethicsverse, this community that we're a part of. Reach out to other people, and everybody is extremely helpful because we're all fighting the same battle in our parts of the world. Anything to add to that, Amber? If not, I got another banger question for you guys.
Yeah, if I could just add one other thing, because I'm seeing a couple of questions pop up. How do you get the folks to be engaged? That's the conversation that you have with the senior executive team, right? So if my boss tells me that this is important for me, then it's important for me, right? I'm gonna be engaged in the process. So that is, one of the key things that we did was engaging the executive team, engaging ERM, engaging senior leadership, so that everyone knew this is important. And they could drive the importance down to those folks, and they participated.
Yeah, and getting that buy-in just allows you to amplify your voice and get done what you need to get done. Michelle, you gave that example of kind of being in a pit and these controls and these policies sort of digging us out of the pit, and that, your leader at that time kind of, the negative connotation of that graded against them. And there's a great comment from George here. George is dropping some hot ones in the chat today. He said, unfortunately, risk is perceived as a negative, and most leaders do not want the responsibility for a negative concept. However, if we use resiliency instead, perhaps more leaders would be on board. And I've never thought about that as like resiliency as sort of the inverse of risk, and how rebranding this kind of a conversation from risk mitigation to resiliency improvement could really maybe paved the way for a little bit more persuasion. With that, though, great job with that comment, George. How do you deal with reputational risk? That could be a whole, webinar in and of itself. How do we do risk assessments on reputational risk? And maybe talk to us about how we would maybe assess that and where you think that would slot into that pie chart that we looked at earlier in the presentation.
So I will say really quickly for my organization, it's a factor in the risk, but again, going back to defining what your universe is, our universe is not reputational risk. That's owned by a separate group. However, as Michelle mentioned, within the regulatory risk assessment, we do have a question around reputation, if that helps.
That does
Yeah.
help. That's an important distinction, I think.
Yeah, it was. It was built into our model because it was that important to us. I will also say that many organizations do this, and that is they have a code of conduct. And at Cox, the code of conduct includes a flow chart for helping you make decisions to doing the right thing and getting to the right place. And in that, one of the questions is like, and I don't remember it exactly, forgive me, but it was like, if this was on the front page of the paper, how would you feel about it? Is that a good thing or a bad thing? You know, that, and just breaking it down to that point, I think is really important.
Somebody taught, one point I want to make is like, I should have been tallying this, but you said story, Michelle, probably 7 times in this presentation. And Amber, you kind of echoed that as well. And so much of our efficacy is the extent to which we're able to know our audience and communicate a story that allows them to like get it. Because again, we like live in this all the time. We live in these heat maps, these structures and these frameworks, and the DOJ guidance is like second nature to us, but we're talking to people that don't get it in many cases. So that storytelling element, the using stories from other organizations. Carla talked about doing a parade of horribles, stories from other organizations in the industry or other organizations where, lack of controls led to, terrible outcomes. Those are great ways to leverage storytelling to like turn the light bulb on why the stuff that we're asking for or the initiatives that we're pushing forward are super important to, again, back to Amber's point, get that endorsement from leaders at the top level or at the middle level to get the people on the front lines whose responses you need to get your job done to actually engage.
Yeah. And can I add just one last point? And I apologize for going back, but the audience member that mentioned risk versus resiliency, one of the things that I think that's important for us as compliance professionals to impart on our business partners is that being in business comes with risk. Everything we do has risk, and having some risk is not bad. Right? It's just inherent in what we are doing to make revenue. But we have to have the controls in place to mitigate that risk, to lessen that risk. So I think I'm on board with changing the framework, but I think it's important also to educate that in the nature of what you're doing, first line, there's risk associated with it. Like that's just the way it is. We all live with risk, and that's okay.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there's risk in getting in your car and driving to the grocery store. There's literally risk in laying in your bed because you can pull a Donnie Darko and maybe airplane engine will fall through your roof. You know what I'm saying? There's risk everywhere. Knows?
Yeah.
So we are like over time. I have a couple of more questions, but I think we should wrap it up. 1,000 bonus points to the almost 200 of you who have stayed. Thank you. Round of applause for Amber. Round of applause for Michelle. This was really a phenomenal presentation. Appreciate you guys kind of diving deep, and you guys brought it all together. It was really phenomenal. A lot of great new frameworks. And great ideas. So appreciate you guys joining us on the Ethics Verse. Check out Artemis Consulting. Check out Cox for all your internet needs. And join us next week. Where we are going to be talking about the ROI of compliance. This is like my favorite topic. I think it's one of the biggest little tweaks you can make to your talk tracks, little tweaks you can make to how you look at your program and its second and third level impacts within your organization to, again, drive the persuasion path forward to get the resources you need. So hope you'll join us next week, Thursday, noon Eastern, and we will see you all next time.